with you. All right, GDP, or gross domestic product, is a primary measure of a country's wealth. Of course, there's lots of ways you might think of measuring wealth. We talked about life expectancy last class. You could think of education. You could think of quality of housing. You could think of leisure time. You could think of happiness. But when it comes down to it, the measure that economists have chosen to use as the main way of examining how well off a country is GDP. Well, why do we worry about GDP? Primarily because GDP, at least real GDP, which takes into account the effects of inflation, real GDP reflects the total income of a country. And of course, total income reflects the total employment of a country. And so if we see real GDP going up, that suggests that there's growth in total income and growth in total employment, which makes a country better off. And so in a very real sense, growth in GDP is going to reflect growth in the economy. Now let's define GDP. Gross domestic product has 4 pieces to it, and all 4 are important. First of all, it's the total market value, right? That implies we're only going to be measuring things that we can get market prices for. Second, it's the total market value of all final goods and services. All right, so these are goods and services that have to trade in a market so that we have a market value, and they have to be the final input. That is, we're not going to count the intermediate products that make up a final good and service, only the final good. All right, gross domestic product of any given country has to be produced inside the borders of that country. Okay, so the gross domestic product of the United States cannot count production that happens in China or India or anywhere else. And finally, it has to be measured during a specific period of time. Now, typically we're talking about GDP annually, and so we're talking about the total market value of final goods and services produced inside the borders of a country within that year. Sometimes we'll be talking about GDP over the last quarter, and then it would be within that quarter. Okay, that definition implies that there's some limitations of GDP. Now, in particular, because it requires market values to measure, GDP is not going to include any non-market activity, such as work in homes. Stay-at-home mothers who clearly contribute to the value of an economy, their efforts are not reflected in the GDP of a country. Criminal activity, that's not going to show up in GDP. The underground economy, not as big a deal in the United States, but in some countries, the underground economy is very, very large, and that's not going to show up in GDP. We're only going to capture the value of goods and services that trade in the market. Okay, so let's just do a gut check to try and understand if we've got our heads wrapped around this concept of GDP. So I want you to think with me, are these things part of GDP? Dinner at a restaurant, dinner at home, construction of an office building, sale of a 10-year-old house, a new car, tires purchased by Ford to put on that new car. All right, pause for just a moment, gut check yourself. Are these part of GDP? All right, let's talk about it. Dinner at a restaurant, yes, for sure. That is a service that transacts in the marketplace inside the borders of your country. That's part of GDP. Dinner at home? Nope, doesn't count. Why? Because dinner at home doesn't occur in the market, right? That's there is no market price for that. However, the groceries that you bought to make that dinner at home do count in GDP. Construction of an office building. Yes, for sure. That is a transaction at a market price inside the borders of your country. That's part of GDP. Sale of a 10-year-old house. Now this one's tricky. No, that's not part of GDP. And why? Because one limitation that I perhaps didn't make clear on the earlier slide is that GDP has to be the sale of a new product. The sale of used products are not part of GDP because they're not produced during that window, right? A 10-year-old house was not built in the last year, and so its value was not part of last year's GDP. Now, I'm being a little bit facetious here because, of course, the sale of a 10-year-old house does generate some value in GDP. In particular, when you sell your house, you generally pay a commission to an agent. That agent's commission is part of GDP, right? Because they created some value during that year. But most of that sale price is not. All right, purchase of a new car, for sure, part of GDP. The tires purchased by Ford to put on that new car, as long as those tires were purchased before the sale of a new car, no, that's an intermediate good, and so we aren't going to count it. And why not? Well, because presumably Ford charges a price for that new car that already covers the cost of all of the intermediate inputs that they used for that car, and so we don't want to double count. Okay, well, when rubber meets the road, how do we go ahead and measure this? There's really two approaches. You could think of GDP in a spending sense, an expenditure sense, or you could think of the flip side of the coin and think of it as an income sense, right? Because everything spent in your country is income to someone, either direct income in the form of a paycheck or income in form of a dividend or equity gain. We're only going to focus on the expenditures method for our class, which is the primary way that the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the BEA, measures GDP in the United States. All right, so in the expenditures approach, GDP is divided into 4 categories: consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. That is exports minus imports. All right, so if we think of each of these categories a little more narrowly, what is consumption? Well, it's pretty much just what it sounds like. Anytime you or I spend money on a final good or services, that's consumption. When we buy a new iPhone, that's consumption. When we buy dinner at a restaurant, that's consumption. When we go and get a haircut, that's consumption. When you pay your tuition, that's consumption. All right, so any consumer durable, consumer non-durable, or services, that's all consumption. Now remember, that has to be consumption of products in the borders of your country. So if you travel to Europe and you buy a great meal of cheese and baguettes in Paris, well, that's not GDP for the United States. That is consumption for you, but your consumption occurred in Paris, which means it's going to contribute to France's GDP, not the US's GDP. So again, in the borders of our country. All right, what about investment? Investment really has 3 big pieces to it. One is business investment. So think of this as capital spending, right? So I purchase new equipment for my factory. As long as that factory is inside the borders of the United States, that's investment. Residential investment, that's just housing, right? So if I build a new house, again, has to be something that occurs in the last year. So if I build a new house or remodel an existing home, the remodel expense or the full price of building a new house is residential investment. And inventory investment, well, anytime a company expands their inventory, that's investment, right? They're investing in inventory. And so when Ford adds a bunch of new cars to their lot, getting ready to sell them, that inventory increases GDP through investment. And then when those cars are actually sold, investment decreases as inventory decreases. So there's a negative effect on investment and a corresponding positive effect in consumption, right? So we add the effect of inventory when it occurs, and then it washes out later when it's actually sold. All right, what about government purchases? You can think of this mostly as federal government spending on actual physical things. So think of this as building roads and bridges, investing in a vaccine, for example. What this is not is transfer payments. So we often think of government spending as, say, stimulus checks, right? Over the last year, you probably received, or over the last 2 years, you probably received some stimulus money from the government. That was government spending, but it's not a government purchase for GDP purposes. It's a transfer payment, right? It's just money transferring from the government's pocket to your pocket. Why don't we count that as part of GDP? Because it will count as GDP when you take that transfer of money from the government and spend it on some form of consumption. All right, and finally, net exports. All we mean here is take all of our exports minus our imports. Right? Exports are pretty straightforward, right? If I produce a good in the United States and then I sell it to China, or I sell it to Germany, or I sell it to Mexico, it doesn't really matter where I sold it to. I produced that inside the borders of the United States, so it should be US GDP. Why do we subtract out imports? Well, because if I'm importing, it's money I'm actually spending on another country, right? And so if you think of many products that we buy, say an iPhone, much of the iPhone is produced in other countries. So if I build that iPhone in China, and then I import it to the US, and then I sell it to you, what this means is that I'm going to subtract out that import cost from GDP. That makes sense because that building of the phone was benefiting China's economy, not the US's economy. And so what I'm going to end up counting from your iPhone is the difference between the price I paid as a consumer and the price Apple paid to import it from China. And that additional margin is reflecting actual benefits to the US economy, right? There's some benefit that Apple adds on top of bringing the phone from China, and that reflects Apple's contribution to the US economy. Okay, so again, 4 categories here: consumption, investment, government spending, net exports. How does the BEA do this? Well, lots and lots and lots of surveys. So they survey consumers throughout the United States to find out what they're spending. They survey businesses to find out what they're investing. The government spending is easy because we can just track that actually down to the dollar level. So that one's not hard. And net exports are actually also fairly simple because of import duties, tariffs, and so on. We've got pretty good tracking of data on exports and imports. But we have to use surveys and extrapolate to get consumption and investment. It takes a long time to collect all of this data, which means we only get to see GDP once a quarter, and we see it with a pretty long lag. So right now, the most recent GDP number we have is from the end of Q3 2021. So we're a bit over a quarter behind, and that's basically how the data goes. It takes a very long time to put all of this together and to create a measure. So it's a great reflection of what's going on in the economy, but it's not a very good real-time reflection. It comes with a lag. All right, some variations on GDP that you should be aware of. First one's per capita GDP. Second one is real versus nominal. And the last one is GDP versus GNP. So let's talk about these 3. Per capita GDP. This is just what it sounds like. We'll take the GDP number and divide it by the population. All right, why is that important? Well, you might have a country that is pretty small, and so their GDP level is not that high in a level sense, but because they have a small population, their GDP divided by their population is quite high. And what really reflects the standard of living, it's not really all about the level of GDP, it's about how much wealth is there for each person in your country. So this is an attempt to get an idea of an average level of income in a nation. Importantly, this is not any kind of an income distribution, right? We could have all of the wealth held in a handful of people and have pretty good looking per capita GDP, even though most people in the country might be pretty poor. So this is not a perfect measure of average wealth, but it gives us a sense of it. Nominal GDP versus real GDP. Nominal GDP is what is usually reported in the news. And what we mean by nominal GDP is just whatever the current production is valued at the current prices. So we take all of that consumption, investment, government spending, net exports, all of the quantities of those things multiplied by the actual prices they paid over the last quarter, add that all up, that gets us nominal GDP. What's the problem with that? Well, the value of all of those things could go up because prices go up. And that would give us a higher nominal GDP, but not any more actual goods and services. That doesn't seem like it would really reflect the well-being of a country very well. If the only reason GDP is growing is because of inflation, we should feel pretty skeptical about GDP reflecting real growth. All right, so real GDP is just an attempt to deal with that. And the way we deal with that, at least conceptually, is to say, let's take the quantities of everything that is bought this year, but let's add them up using some other year's prices. Let's keep those prices constant. All right, so at a very high level, you can think of this right now as the standard for real GDP in the United States is to use 2012 prices. So let's take the prices of everything you might buy, cars and refrigerators and food and everything else. Let's take those prices as of 2012, and then let's use those prices when we're calculating out the value of all of the quantities of goods and services consumed now in 2022. Of course, there's problems with that, right? Well, what do you do when there's not a price for something, right? Doesn't always work, right? Suppose we have a new invention that takes off in 2022 that's related to Facebook's push for the metaverse. I don't know what it is, some sort of virtual glasses. We have no prices for those in 2012. So what do? Well, we have to make some assumptions, and of course that is subjective. So real GDP is not perfect, but it is an attempt to deal with the fact that prices can change because of inflation, and we don't want to call the wealth of a nation increasing solely because prices went up. All right. Once we have these two measures, that implies a relationship between the two that we call the GDP deflator, which is just defined as take our nominal GDP divided by our real GDP. This deflator is just a measure of inflation, right? It's just a measure of the change in prices, right? The only difference between nominal GDP and real GDP is the prices now relative to the prices at some point in the past. And so that ratio tells us how much did the prices go up or down, as the case may be. It's not the typical measure of inflation that we use in the United States, but it is a measure that can be tracked. It's a nice measure in the sense that it's pretty comprehensive, right? It's designed to capture the prices of everything that's in GDP, which should be everything that is bought in the borders of our country. All right, finally, GDP versus GNP. GNP is gross national product. The difference here is on where the production occurs. So remember, with GDP, the production has to occur inside the borders of your country. With GNP, we're going to add up the value of all final goods and services produced from resources that are owned by residents of our country. So that production could occur anywhere as long as the resources are owned by US residents. So what's the difference here? Think again of that iPhone, right? And GDP, the import of the iPhone that's primarily manufactured in China doesn't count to US GDP. But it would count to US GNP because those resources are owned by Apple, and Apple is owned primarily by US residents. All right. In practice, GNP was more popular in the past and is not commonly used to evaluate country wealth in the current time. All right, let's talk about a few limitations of these GDP measures. One of them, it's not going to value leisure time at all. So suppose that a country made a choice to work less and go hiking more, or hang out and watch TV more. That might increase the well-being of a country. You might be happier, but that shift would be a negative hit on GDP, right? We would not value that leisure time in GDP at all. Right. Similarly, we're not going to value any non-market economic activities. Right? If it doesn't happen in the market, we're stuck. All right, so the stay-at-home mom, which we already talked about, doesn't contribute to GDP as it is measured. GDP can't measure or doesn't attempt to measure environmental quality, resource depletion, the environmental effects of our consumption. None of this is measured in GDP, right? So if our production happens from factories that pollute a lot, and that pollution ruins our air quality and gives us all asthma, that would make our lives worse off, even though GDP would react positively. More broadly, GDP doesn't measure quality of life in any real sense, right? It measures the value of goods and services produced, but not what those do for your life or quality of life. And as such, it doesn't capture anything about poverty or inequality. All right, so GDP is a useful measure because we can define it pretty consistently across countries, but it's not going to get at a lot of the things we might care about when we talk about how well off is a country. All right, and finally, although we can define the way we measure this thing pretty consistently across countries, to add them up, we're going to have to make an assumption on what different currencies are worth, right? I've got to convert Chinese yuan and Japanese yen and British sterling and euro and Mexican pesos and so on. I've got to convert all of those into a common currency so that we can talk about what's the value of GDP in the US versus Mexico versus China versus Japan versus Europe and so on. All right. In practice, we just do this based on exchange rates, but sometimes those exchange rates are not a great way to do this, and that's particularly true if exchange rates are manipulated as they are in some countries, right? So countries that try and sort of fix their exchange rates, that makes this comparison a little bit biased. Alternatively, we can try and compare across country using something we call PPP adjusted GDP. That's purchasing power parity adjusted. And the idea there is we're going to try and hold constant the buying power of the dollar across every country. So that when we talk about a dollar in the US and a dollar in London and a dollar in Beijing, we're talking about the same amount of buying power in each place. All right, that's pretty hard to do. You have to make some pretty strong assumptions, but that's something that economists do. Is that let's try and hold constant the buying power across countries, and then look at GDP accordingly. And we call that a PPP adjusted GDP. All right. So to summarize up the limitations, this is a famous quote from Robert Kennedy. GDP does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. All right. In a very real sense, GDP is a narrow measure, and we should keep that in mind as we use it. All right. Ultimately, though, GDP is going to be our measure, one of our primary measures of economic growth, by which we mean the increase in the quantity and the quality of goods and services that an economy produces. And why do we care about that? Because if we're producing more and better goods and services, our living standards are going up, right? The fact that today we have cell phones that are also computers that can do more than any computer in the world that existed 30 years ago can do, means that our lifestyle is better, our living standard is higher. And so we want to see an economy and a country improve its quality of life. And we're going to measure that primarily by percentage changes in real GDP or real GDP per capita, as the case may be. So let's take a look at the data for the US. Here I'm graphing for you both nominal GDP, that's in blue, and real GDP, which is there in red. And you'll see those two things cross at 2012 because, again, right now the US measures real GDP in 2012, and so those should be equal in that year. Okay? And you can see whether we're talking about real GDP or nominal GDP, the long-term trends here, which we're measuring from the late 40s until today, look very, very similar. In nominal terms, US GDP is currently about $23.2 trillion. And in real terms, we're a bit under 20 trillion, 19.4 trillion approximately. Okay, look at the patterns here. You notice the long-term trend, of course, is good. That implies that overall the quality of life in the United States should be improving over the last 70 years. The shaded bars here that you see represent recessions. And you'll notice, at least in the more recent recessions, particularly in the financial crisis, there right before 2010 and during COVID, you'll see that, look, recessions were accompanied by a decrease in GDP. GDP fell. It fell especially sharply during the COVID pandemic, although you see we've had a very sharp recovery since then as well. One other thing I'll just point out is, look here at the difference at the end of the chart between nominal and real GDP. Real GDP in red, we're roughly just a little bit higher than we were in real GDP terms before COVID happened. So, that implies we've lost a couple of years of growth. In contrast, nominal GDP in blue, we're higher than we were before COVID happened. What does the difference between those two things suggest? Inflation, right? It suggests that a substantial portion of the growth in nominal GDP that we've seen over the last year is due to rising prices rather than rising quantities. All right, what if we look at this in a per capita sense? Well, here I'm looking at changes, percentage changes over the last year. in real GDP and in real GDP per capita. Real GDP is in red and per capita is in green. And you'll see in terms of growth, at least in the United States, the growth in real GDP and the growth in real GDP per capita mirror each other almost perfectly. And so for the US, we can pretty safely just talk about real GDP growth as our measure of well-being. For other countries where population is changing significantly, those differences might be larger. And so we should be careful. But for the US, it turns out that looking at this in a per capita or overall sense is basically gives you the same picture. All right. Growth rates here give us an idea of what's going on with the economy. Again, we'd like to see this mostly positive growth, which again, mostly has been, with the exception of recession time periods where we see the growth turns negative generally. All right, well, that's GDP, a brief introduction. We're going to spend some more time on GDP in the homework, and that'll give you a little bit better sense of what the components of GDP look like in the US and what the relative importance of those is. But for now, we'll close off here. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out, and we look forward to next time.